Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Tom Reynolds. I'm a Vice President here at Export Solutions. I'd like to welcome you all to today's webinar, which is about denied party screening. In fact, the title of this session is 5 questions to answer about denied party screening, and there are probably more than 5 questions out there and topics to talk on, but we're going to focus on the ones that we typically hear the most and get the most questions about. And so I hope this is an informative session for you. We've got a full house today. These sessions are limited to 100 people, and I think we have more than that registered. So that leads me into my next topic, which is how we typically handle these going forward. This session is being recorded, and we do offer it for free for anybody who signs up on our website. So one of the things that you can do if you aren't able to get in today, or if you miss it for whatever reason, is within a week, usually we will have a recording of this posted on our website, and you can go back there and view it and use it for your internal company purposes as well. I hope that all of you can see me, or sorry, not see me, but hear me, and that you can see these slides okay. If you have any kind of technical issues with GoToWebinar, you can communicate with me via the questions box or the chat box on your screen, and we'll try to resolve those. But primarily, you can either dial into the audio through the telephone or use voice over IP. There's 2 options for you there. And, of course, you just need to click the link that was provided to you when you registered in order to see the slides that we have. We will be stopping for questions at various points along the way. However, because of the number of people that are on here and just the technical issues with it, we're not going to unmute anybody. So everybody is muted right now, and you'll stay muted throughout the call. However, if you would like to talk with us or ask questions, I would just suggest that you use the chat or the Q&A box on your toolbar, and then we will be pausing at various points, and we'll get those questions addressed for you as quickly as we can. One of the questions that we get asked a lot is about the slides, and I'm just getting some feedback there. Okay. A lot of people want to know about the slides and whether they'll get a copy of the slides. Those will also be available on our website. You can download a PDF of them, again, for free. We just ask that you use them for internal company purposes, obviously not to sell them or transfer them to anybody else. But those will be available on our website, usually within a week from today as well. I did want to mention we offer a series of free webinars around trade compliance throughout the year. And we have our next one is coming up actually in January. We're going to take a few months off because of the holiday time frame being so busy and everything like that. But this next one, for any of you who have companies that maybe you're in the United States and you're doing business with Canadian companies, or vice versa, you have a Canadian company who's trying to do business in the United States, or maybe you have both. Maybe you have a company with divisions all over Canada and U.S. This next webinar is going to be one that's going to be important for you to attend. It's going to be hosted by Clint Shuchuk, who's a member of our team who's got 30 years of experience in Canadian export regulations. And Clint is going to be talking to us about some of the key things and key differences and similarities between Canadian and U.S. export controls. So we're going to talk about not only ITAR and EAR, but all of the regulations up in Canada as well. You can register for that at this link here, or you can also always go to our website, which is exportsolutionsinc.com. Just click the webinar button up at the top of the page that you see highlighted there, and that's where you can register for all of our future sessions, as well as access all of the recordings and the slides from our previous sessions as well. And we have our full lineup for next year published on the website, so I think we're doing 5 webinars total next year. Well, like I said, my name is Tom Reynolds. I'm the Vice President. But at this point, I'd like to introduce and bring on board Marcy Gentry, who's our senior consultant. Marcy's going to be talking to us today about the denied party screening, and I will hand it over to her now. Are you there, Marcy?
Yes, thanks, Tom.
Sure.
So today's session, and welcome for everyone that's listening. As Tom alluded to earlier, we're going to talk about the 5 questions. The 5 questions that we're going to focus on today is, what if we don't screen? So what happens if we don't screen as a company, if we're exporting items, or if we have foreign persons that work for us? What if we don't screen? What are the chances of us getting caught? What list should we screen? So there's lots of different lists out there. There's many different providers that can sell you list up to 100, 200 different types of lists, and so which one should you really be screening against and which one should you focus on? Then how can you accomplish the screen? So there's many different ways of screening. You can do it manually or automated, and we'll talk about the different ways that you can implement screening within your company, and then we'll talk about how often should you screen. So that really depends on your company and your business processes, your manufacturing process times, your supply chain. So it really goes into detail as when should you screen and how often should you screen the different entities. And then what should you do if you have a match to one of the entities that's on one of the lists. So just kind of a background as to why do you need to screen. I get the questions a lot from our customers and clients as to, is it a requirement to screen? The answer to that is no, it's not a requirement to screen. However, how will you know if you're selling or doing business with or providing technology to a person that's on one of those lists if you don't screen? So one of the things that you need to be aware of is that you want to comply with the different regulations. The first one here is EAR under the general prohibitions, that you're not allowed to do business or an exporting business under General Prohibition 4 to individuals that have denial orders against them. The denial orders are really those individuals that have been listed and prohibited from doing or receiving U.S. exports. And these can be entities that have violated the export regulations. These are entities that are known drug traffickers, terrorists. These may have also been entities that have received export licenses in the past, and part of those licenses was a proviso for the U.S. government to come in to make sure that they're doing what they say they're doing on the export license, and they denied the U.S. government from coming in. And so those are some of the things where they talk about the unverified list. And then there's other entities that are known to make weapons of mass destruction, so they're known to do research and development in nuclear weapons, biological, chemical weapons, or they're known to produce missiles, long-range missiles, and other items that can hinder the national security of the U.S. The next regulation is debarment. So under the ITAR 127.7 is debarment. Once again, these are also a list of entities that the U.S. government has posed to have concerns with if you're dealing with exports. So what happens if you do not screen? So what is the risk to your company if you don't screen? A lot of companies that we find out are not screening. 25% of companies don't screen at all that are out there. They just don't know that you're required to, well, you're not required, that you should be screening to make sure that your company is not doing business with any of these entities. And once again, these entities can be in the U.S. and they can be outside the U.S. So when we talk about doing business with these types of people that are on these lists or companies that are on these lists, you also really need to take a look at your domestic transactions as well, because they may have an intent to export. And so it's really what this all revolves around when you're dealing with these restricted parties, denied parties, unverified parties, is that you're not going to help in an export transaction is what it boils down to. 30% of companies who screen only do it manually, so they don't have some type of automated tool. They may be using the government lists that are published online. They may be using Excel spreadsheets. They may be going through federal registers or going list by list through the different government websites. 60% of small and medium-sized companies do not have a documented export policy and program around restricted party screening. So a lot of companies just kind of wing it and will screen an entity, usually a customer, at the time they receive an order, but there's nothing around when you should be screening again, what other entities you should be screening in a transaction other than the customer. So we'll talk about all of those things, of the different types of entities you should be screening. One of the things you need to be aware of is that according to the U.S. Census Bureau, and I apologize that these are about a year old, but we try to get updated statistics, but the websites are down from the government. But according to the changes between 2011 and 2012, exports grew 7.7%. And from what I've been seeing over the past year, the exports have come up and gone down, but for the most part, the average is that they're going up on the export side of it. In 2010, 97.8% of all exporters were small and medium-sized businesses. So most people think because they are a smaller company that the government's not going to go after you. But if you really look at some of the enforcement cases that have been out there, they are looking at all companies. And the reason for that is that the government themselves has automated certain tools like the automated export system, for which they can now take a look and screen automatically and know what's going out of the country. What happens if you don't screen? Your carrier may hold your shipment. So a lot of carriers that have been out there have been in trouble, and we'll have some examples of some of those carriers that have received fines or penalties from the government for shipping items to denied parties. So even though you as the exporter may be sending things overseas, your carriers, if they're U.S. carriers, are also responsible for making sure that they comply with the regulations regarding restricted parties. They have implemented automated screening tools, so if you're using something like a FedEx ship station, a UPS station, there is screening that goes on in the background, and the carriers are alerted as to whether or not you may be shipping something to restricted parties. Sometimes those carriers will come back and tell you, sometimes they won't. They may just report you to the government. So it just depends on who you're using and what their policy is. And what will happen is that those carriers will hold the shipment if they see something that is a restricted party. But let me just kind of tell you, you don't want to rely on your carrier to do the screening for you. You really should be doing the screening up front, and for many different reasons. You don't really want to build something if you're not allowed to ship it to them or do business with that entity. So you should be screening up front just to save on your own internal costs. In addition to that, once again, those carriers don't have to come back to you and tell you that who you're shipping to is a restricted party. They just may report you, and then it's too late. If you're shipping something and you require an AES record or an automated export system record, that's generally anything that's going out under an export license. Any items that fall under the ITAR require AES records, and then anything that has a $2,500 value per Schedule B or over, $2,500, those require AES records. The AES system also does this background screening, and customs will be alerted if there's a restricted party that pops up. They will seize your shipment, hold it, and give you a call. And there's an example that we have later on where we have had clients in the past where customs has showed up at their door asking them why they're shipping to restricted parties. You can receive fines and penalties. So just like any other violation under the regulations, it's up to $1 million per fine. It's depending on which list and entity that you're shipping to, what violation was made. You could end up yourself on one of those lists. So if you're repeatedly selling to a restricted parties, your company can become a restricted party themselves. And as I stated earlier, some of the entities that are on those restricted parties list are people that have violated the regulations. And if you look at their ship-to address or the address that's related to that entity, sometimes they're in prison. So it is a very realistic thing for you to take a look at those restricted parties list while you are doing your transactions. So the example that we have here is that there was an aerospace manufacturer that was selling scrap parts. So they had an abundance of parts that they would sell online to different customers. And in this particular case, they had a university student from China that wanted to purchase some scrap integrated circuits that were classified as EAR 99. What this company did is they didn't screen any of their online orders against those restricted parties lists. The university itself was on one of the entities lists, but the student was not. So the case here is that you need to be screening both the university and the student if they were to screen. The aerospace manufacturer didn't think they needed to screen the entity either because it was an EAR 99 item, which if you look at the way the regulations are is that Some of the entities can't receive anything, whether it's EAR 99 or whether it's an ITAR item. They're just not allowed to receive anything from the U.S. There are some cases where some entities are allowed to receive EAR 99 items, and we'll talk about that a little bit later, of how you can find out what the restrictions are for people that are on those lists or companies that are on those lists. What happened is that this aerospace manufacturer had their goods seized by Customs. They had a call from Customs and a visit by BIS to review their internal compliance program, and all over just an integrated circuit that was going to a student in China that was trying to use it for their program. So why did this happen? Well, the distributor didn't screen, thinking once again that it was just EAR 99, so they didn't think that they needed to screen. But this entity in particular, this university, is not allowed to receive EAR 99 items. So since the student was affiliated with the university, the restriction on the university also falls to the student. The ship-to address was also to a university address, so therefore the whole transaction is becoming a restricted parties transaction. So what should this exporter have done? The exporter should have screened both the student and the university and the address. And a lot of times what folks will do is just screen the names of the ship-to entity or the customer and not the address. And what happens a lot of times is that companies that have violated the export regulations or that have ended up on one of these restricted parties lists will just change their name but keep the same address. So it's due diligence to actually screen the address itself. And if the name doesn't match, do a little bit more background to make sure that the entity is not the same entity with a new name of the company. You can process the screening whether it's automated or manual, so you have to take a look at your company and understand what's going to be the best solution for you. If you have 2 or 3 exports a week, you can probably get it done manually. If you have hundreds of transactions during a week, you're probably going to want to automate it, or you're going to have a full-time person that's manually auditing or reviewing and screening against those transactions. You'll also want to make sure that you record the transactions for future reference, so that if somewhere down the road you are audited by BIS or Customs or the Director of Defense Trade Controls, the State Department, that you have backup that says, yes, we did screen these entities. And I'll tell you, I've been in different situations where an entity was okay to, and if you don't screen them again, then you have to hold the transaction or the transaction goes out. What you want to make sure you do by having those records is that when you ship the goods out, you've done the screening, and it's proof that you did the screening and it was okay at the time that you made the shipment, that the person was okay. As long as the item has already exported out of the U.S. If the items are still in the U.S. and the entity gets put on the list, then what has to happen is you'll need to call your freight forwarder and try and retrieve back the shipment. So there's some due diligence there as to the timing, which we'll get into a little bit later on. But the key here is just to make sure that you record the screening transaction so you have proof that you did it and that you checked it. If you do have a sale and you do have a match that's on the list, it's important to make sure that you deny the sale to it. Stop the shipment and then let your customer know that you can't do business with them unless you get a license. And unfortunately, licenses are presumed to be denied when you're dealing with a restricted party. There are some cases and instances where they will allow a license, but that's few and far between. You really have to read the register and the restrictions on what the requirements are for that individual that's listed on the entities list. So as I talked about earlier, there are a few carriers out there and freight forwarders that have had violations. The example here is DHL Holdings in the U.S. Violated the EAR by forwarding items subject to the EAR, including a strobe, networking equipment, and printers to Saudi Arabia on behalf of parties which were subject to a temporary denial order. And so that was public record for DHL, and so they have now implemented a lot of screening that takes place that happens behind the scenes so that they make sure that they're not shipping items to that, even though they're not the persons that sold the equipment to this entity in Saudi Arabia. A next example here is FedEx. FedEx did receive a $370,000 fine for 6 violations of selling items to a denied party, both in China and in the UAE. So FedEx, again, is another one of those companies that does do behind-the-scenes screening. And I can assure you that UPS and the other freight forwarders have followed suit because they don't want those fines as well. It only takes one to get hit before the others follow. This is just another example as to one of the things that have happened with selling items to denied parties. Some of these companies will get stopped with fines, and the government will come in and stop the different things that happen. Other times they'll just get a slap on the wrist and see what's happening, and they'll just have their equipment seized. Next piece, what list should we screen? So there are really 5 lists that if you're dealing with exports that are under the EAR or the ITAR, there's really 5 lists that you should be checking. The denied parties list, the unverified list, the entities list, the debarred list, and the specially designated nationals list. We have the 6th bullet point here to include embargoed and sanctioned checks. What happens with a lot of tools, if you get an automated tool, is that they will include the embargoed countries. So they will check to make sure that you're not exporting things to Cuba, to North Korea, to Iran, and bring up red flags. But you should include that when you are doing a denied party screen. If you have an internal tool that you're making, that you would also add those embargoed countries to the list. But ideally, the first 5 bullet points here are the lists that you should be screening. And the U.S. government, will show you in a minute, does have a consolidated list except for the website's down due to the government closure. But you can get those lists there. They're consolidated and they're in an ASCII and a CSV file format. We'll show you that in a minute. You can do those screenings that way. The other thing that we suggest is if you do create your own automated screening tool or you use a third-party vendor tool, is that you would add in hot words, and I've seen a lot of companies do that. And what I mean by hot words is that this would look for names in the ship to address and even maybe in shipping instructions or other instructions that you may have in your orders, sales orders, that would include words like nuclear, missile, military, that would just stop the shipment and kind of give a red flag as to end use. And sometimes you can do that, sometimes you can't. When you're dealing with an entity like Dell or Amazon, where you have thousands of shipments and you're dealing with individuals that are all over the place and companies that are located all over the place, and you have thousands of transactions a day, it's very hard to check end use every single time. So there's checks that they put in place to kind of put in there to look for end use. So you can always add that in as another line item to check and put in the words as if they were a name to check against all the different sections in your orders if you're doing an automated screen. So what list should be checked? So there's the consolidated list that I was just talking about. It's on export.gov. And these lists are in the CSV or ASCII download format. I'll tell you they're not pretty, but you can also sign up for any updates to those lists. And what you'll have to do is go back and check all of the entities that you've already screened with anything that is new, consolidated list. This is a good way to do it if you have only 2, 3, 4, or 5 transactions a week. If you get into a little bit more transactions than that, this is probably not the best method, and I'll explain in a little bit as to what you have to be careful with. Some of the sample results, when you're looking at the list, like I said, it's in that ASCII format. So if you are typing in a name, you're going to have to type it in the way that it's spelled on the list, and sometimes that's not, you don't always get the right spelling, especially when you have the language translations. They don't always translate to the right spelling as to what's on the list. So you have to be kind of careful that when you are using these manual lists that you're typing in different variations of the way that you would spell it, because these are an exact match and you may miss something that's on the list. Other ways that you can do it is you can hire a third-party company. Lots of these companies are out there. We use visual compliance. We recommend it. It's one of the better tools that I've seen out there, but there are certainly other vendors that are out there. These vendors will not only provide the 5 lists that we showed you, but there's also other lists that they've added on. You'll see there's like the FBI Most Wanted list. They will also add lists that are from other countries. So not only does the U.S. have these restricted parties lists, but other countries. The EU has their own list, Japan has their own list, Australia has their own list. So if you're doing business in those countries and exporting from those countries, if you have a subsidiary in those countries, you'll want to make sure you check those lists too. So that's where a third-party vendor can come in and add those lists that you need. In addition to that, you may want to check in other areas of your company, like your procurement organization, your contracts organization, especially if you're dealing with military or defense contracts. There are different lists out there of entities that are not allowed to do government contracts, and those lists are pretty similar to, or those, if they're having a third-party vendor, they may have incorporated the restricted parties list as well. But you can add those lists to where procurement can use this as well to make sure that they're not contracting with someone that's not allowed to do government contracts as well. So you can tailor third-party lists to whatever you need, your need is. There's just some additional lists. You may want to add things like the FBI wanted fugitives if you're doing background screening checks internally. That's where you would want to add some of these other things. You may not want to be doing business anyway with somebody that's on one of those lists, even though they're not an export violation. You still probably may not want to be doing some business with a criminal. So it's kind of just different things that you can add into the different types of lists. So what lists should we screen? So for these expanded lists, including other countries, it's good to know if your suppliers, customers are in trouble with other governments or agencies. So that's why you may want to add those other countries even if you don't have subsidiaries overseas. You just want to make sure that whoever you're doing business with is in good standing. Because what may happen is if you have a contract with your customer to do repair work or even defense services or engineering work with them, if they're not allowed to export from their country, they may be violating the export regulations over there, and then you're a party to that transaction. You may become in trouble with that foreign government. I mean, it's kind of pushing it there, but it's a good idea to do some background screening on all of your customers and anybody that you do business with. One of the examples we have here is if you're a material testing type of company where you're bringing in materials from another company and you're testing it, verifying it, doing quality work on it, or you may be even doing some type of manufacturing process and then exporting it back out. You just want to make sure that all of the companies that you're doing business with are not on one of those lists. I'm going to stop there for a moment and see if there's any questions.
Great, thanks, Marcy. We do have a few questions coming in. One is more of a clarification, I think. So the person wrote, can you please clarify, did you say we should be screening domestic and international? So
it is, sure, it is best practice to do domestic and international. I'll tell you, a lot of people do focus on international, but what can happen is if you have a domestic customer that's a front company, and that's generally what happens when people get in trouble, is that they set up these front companies, Chinese procurement companies, Iranian procurement companies will set up a U.S. company, tell you that they're not exporting, and then they will go on and export. A lot of those companies have been in trouble, and they've been put on the list, so you want to make sure that they're not on the list. The other thing is that if you're dealing with suppliers or customers in the U.S. and you are exporting and they may not be necessarily exporting for that customer, if for some reason you are transactional, let me kind of clarify a different way. If you have a subcontractor and you're contracting work out to them and then that part comes back to you and you will be exporting, that subcontractor is benefiting from the export. So the way that the regulations are written is that the these entities, these parties, cannot benefit from an export. So there's kind of a fine line there that you should be really looking at all entities in a transaction, your suppliers, your customers, distributors, freight forwarders, and your employees should all be screened against these restricted parties lists.
Great, thanks. Yeah, I mean, just to build on that point, there are many people on the list that are U.S. persons, U.S. companies, et cetera. So trying to delineate between domestic and international, I don't think is the right way to approach it. It's more about, like you said, screening the right segment of your base.
Yeah, and generally it's a lot easier just to implement screening everything than trying to segregate international and domestic. And I know some companies will have an international section and a domestic customer service section, but you really should incorporate it throughout for every transaction.
Okay, here's the government shutdown question. With the government being shut down, what happens to the companies that do their own denied parties checks? Is there an alternative way to check, or are we just stuck at a standstill?
You're kind of stuck at a standstill. The Federal Register should still be published, and that's kind of a challenge to figure out the Federal Registers. What BIS does have is they send out notifications if there's a Federal Register published. Now what you have to do is you have to go and check the Federal Register, which is another issue because generally you have to sign up to get the Federal Registers, and there's a fee and stuff for that. So that's a good point of if you are using the online tool, you are kind of stuck at this point in time unless you have the resources to go in and look at the Federal Registers. This is probably the first time I've seen it where the government websites are shut down. Although I know when BIS was updating their website, that website was down quite a bit in the last 2 to 3 months. So if you are relying on that transaction on the online tool, hopefully in the next week or two the websites will come back up and you'll be okay. I haven't seen any Federal Registers come out in the last week and a half of entities being added to the list. So you'll be okay if you have the current list. But if you haven't downloaded it, then you're kind of stuck at this point in time for the screen.
I would add to that too. I did see late last week OFAC indicated that even though the shutdown was going on, that they were still going to be making updates to the SDN list. So again, that's not across the board, but OFAC did announce that they would continue to update that throughout the shutdown.
So there's not an easy answer to the question as to when the shutdown is done. Your best bet is to maybe see if you can get a third party tool to use during the temporary time. Things for us, we can do it too, not to just sit there and sell our services, but there may be other ways that you can do the screening if need be during the time if you can't get to those lists as well.
Great, thanks. Here's another question. If a party shows up on the World Bank list, are they considered a restricted party?
Not necessarily, but most of the people that are on the World Bank list are also on one of these other lists. So that's a good point that someone brought that up, because what else can happen is if you deal with letters of credit, the banks have their own list to check. And if they find a restricted party on the World Bank list, then they're going to report it. So most of the people that are on the World Bank list are these parties, but there's some additional parties that are on the World Bank list too that are not on the restricted parties list.
It's kind of a case-by-case basis, it sounds like.
It is. It is.
Okay. Here's another question. Is it okay to screen our party after the sale has occurred?
It's okay to screen it. If you find that they are a restricted party, then you've already violated the regulations. So obviously you want to screen before it happens. But if you've screened after the sale has happened and after you've already shipped the products, and it's really the key here is that after you've shipped the products, you can have the sale, but if you haven't shipped the products, you find out they're on the restricted parties list, then you can terminate the sale and not ship the goods. But if you've already shipped the goods, the violation has already occurred. So then in that case, you would want to do a voluntary disclosure and make every effort to try to get the items back to the U.S. But I've seen companies try that and have not been very successful in getting the goods back because they're usually entities that aren't willing to send the items back.
Great. Well, let's go ahead and continue. We do have more questions coming in, and we'll get to as many of them as we can. But for now, let's go through the rest of the next stopping point.
Okay. So how should we accomplish the screening? So we've talked a little bit about the manual. We've showed you the government website, what they kind of look like, and then there's the different automated tools that are out there. We're going to show you eCustoms visual compliance software. We'll show you a demo of that. But there really are lots of different automated solutions that you can do. If you're using the Oracle ERP system or the SAP ERP system, JD Edwards ERP system, they all have modules that allow for screening to happen in their system. One of the things that you would do is you would either have to manually upload the list yourself by typing in all the different names or downloading it from the government website, or you can go to a third-party provider like eCustoms or MK Data and get those lists sent to you on a regular basis and download them into your ERP system. Then your ERP system can do the screening itself, and you can set that up on however you want to at the time that the customer is entered into your system, or you can do it at the time you get ready to ship. Sometimes you do it at both times, and we'll talk about that as far as the timing and when you should be screening. But there's really different ways of accomplishing it. I've also seen clients where they've used the online lists that we showed you earlier. They download those into an Access database, and then they upload their customer names into the Access database, and they screen that way. It gets very tricky when you're dealing with screening, though, because you have to deal with this, what we call fuzzy logic, and I'll show you that here in a minute too, but it's that exact name match. So if the names are spelled differently, somebody's typed the name in incorrectly into your system, and it doesn't quite match, and you're using those manual checks, there's a good chance that it may not pick up. So if you have some good internal IT folks that can kind of do this fuzzy logic on spelling, say Mohammed different ways, it's spelled so many different ways, but that it can pick that up and they know how to do those algorithms in there, then you could probably design your own tool. But there's other things too. If you're dealing with like an eCustoms visual compliance tool or an MK Data tool, you can manually type information in there, or you can send data to their systems. They screen it and they send you things back. So there's lots of different ways to actually perform the screening. It just depends on how much you want to spend and how much time you have and IT support that you have, and the number of transactions that you have. So the demo for the manual screen, our company is associated with the following parties. So we have these different entities here, Klaus Buhler. We also have Kind Hearts from Charitable Humanitarian Development, and a supplier, L&M Manufacturing in Connecticut. If you're doing the manual screen and you type in Klaus Buhler, one of the things I would suggest that you do is you just type in the first name or the last name, because if you look up here on the ASCII format that's on the government website, it's not put in as Klaus Buhler. It's Buhler, comma, Klaus. So you've got to be kind of careful of how you do the screening. You can't just put in Klaus Buhler. You'll have to kind of break it up on how you do it. One of the things that you'll do when it pops up and you do find that the person's on the list, it's going to give you a Federal Register number. That's the 70 Federal Register F57349. What that's going to do is that's where the entity was listed, published, and they ended up on one of the lists. So in this case, they ended up on the debarred list. And if you pull up that Federal Register, you're going to get this information that we've kind of highlighted in this box, and it's going to tell you a little bit more about the entity. Sometimes they'll give you an address, sometimes they'll give you a birth date. In this case, they gave you the federal case number, which you can go search on the federal case number to get more information about the individual. In the Federal Register, will also tell you if you can ship things like EAR 99 items to them. In this case, this person is debarred for 3 years and they can't receive anything that's under the ITAR. And so that doesn't mean that they can't receive EAR items, it just means they can't receive anything that falls under the ITAR. So you do have to kind of read these. and look to see if you can do business. So if you're selling something under the EAR, technically you can export something to them under the EAR. But I caution you, I'm not sure you really want to do business with someone and send them EAR items if they're on the debarred list. I mean, that's kind of your decision in your company if you want to continue to do business with them. One of the things here, too, is that, you know, at the end of the 3-year period, the above person will remain on the debarred list. So even while it says they're only on there for 3 years, here we are in 2013, they haven't been removed from the list. So they are still debarred until they ask to have their names removed from the list. And they have to write in and ask to have their names removed from the list. The next example we have here is Kind Hearts. According to their website, they were a non-profitable organization to get money for disaster relief and different types of things overseas. In reality, what they were is a company that was getting money for the Hamas and developing money for that for the terrorist group. And so they ended up being on one of the lists. And so one of the things you want to make sure that you look at when you're doing restricted party screening is also kind of do an end use check on the company itself. L&M Manufacturing, here's another example. If you're doing the screen, once again you always want to take a look, is and with the symbol or is it spelled out? So those are the types of things you have to take into account. Once again, you'll take a look here, it refers to the debarred list and to the ITAR list. So you want to just make sure that you take a look at that Federal Register number to see what the requirements are around that. The next piece here is we're going to a visual compliance demo just so that you get an idea as to what an online tool looks like and different things that you can do. We'll look here at Wayne Smith is the first one. We'll go into the visual compliance tool here. And normally if you would have an address, I would tell you to put in the address. If you know where you're shipping it to, I would add the country. You don't always have to do it. This section here is what I was talking about, some of the things that you need to take a look at, where it's going to be an exact match, which is going to be where the name's going to match exactly the way that you type it in. I don't recommend that. I always would say do a fuzzy logic, and a lot of the vendors out there will have this fuzzy logic in different degrees. We usually use the medium one. You could do the phonetic one as well, but the fuzzy logic is pretty much the same as well. And then there's just different types of clicks that you can do to kind of help so that you get down to what the right person is. Depending on how you subscribe to one of these third-party vendors is depending on which list that you have. So I showed you there's 4 pages that Visual Compliance offers. I know MK Data offers similar lists, and then you can also purchase different lists from other vendors that are out there and decide how you're going to screen and what you're going to screen against. So the key thing here is that when you do have an entity that comes up, in this case there is a hit on this particular name on here, this vendor will put the Federal Register and they have a link specifically to that Federal Register, and that gives you a little bit more information. So if you haven't seen a Federal Register, this is what it looks like. This is where all the laws are published, and you'll see other things from different entities, but this is where you're going to take a look at it. And the next thing I would tell you to do, just a second to get over here and get my search button. Right here it's going to give you the complete address of this entity, when they were convicted, and then you see that there's the P. So Wayne Smith is a very common name. So if you are shipping something to a person that's named Wayne Smith, my next thing would be to ask the customer their middle name or middle initial, if you can get that from them. Then you want to take a look at the address to see if the address is similar. If it's in a different state, they have a different middle name with a, let's say it's Wayne Edward Smith, so it's E, it's not the same entity. So those are the types of things that you're going to look at when you are screening. The other thing that you can do is always look at the case number too to give you some more information on that. The next name we're going to screen here is Pratt & Whitney. And you can either, in this case, you can put it in the name or into the company. Let's go ahead and put it in the company name. And most of you didn't know that Pratt & Whitney was on the list, right? Here's the key thing here with Pratt & Whitney. You have to take a look at the Federal Register, because most of you, if you're in the defense industry, and especially aerospace industry, you're probably doing some type of business with Pratt & Whitney. So Pratt & Whitney is not completely debarred, they're not completely restricted, but you do have to take a look at this Federal Register notice to find out what the issues are, what you can and cannot export. So if you look at here, it prohibits the Department of State from issuing licenses or other approvals for export of defense articles or defense services for the applicant or any party, so forth and so on. And it's just telling you it's on a case-by-case basis. So really what's happening here with Pratt & Whitney is they're not allowed to participate in brand new projects. In Pratt & Whitney Canada, I should say that, Pratt & Whitney Canada is not allowed to participate in new business with U.S. government military contracts. And so they can still support things that they already are involved with going forward. As you can see, everything's on a case-by-case basis. So it's key here that even if you have a hit against the list, that you go into the Federal Register and read what all of the requirements are in regards to the entity that's on that list. The next entity here, oops. Once again, you'll want to take a look at this and go into the Federal Register and see what you can and cannot ship to for this entity. It's always good to read it to make sure that you're not prohibiting a sale if you can actually do the sale, but you also want to make sure that just because someone's on the list that that you're not allowed to do anything. Okay. So this will give you some other information on here. It'll give you some aliases too for those entities. So as you can see, there's a bunch of different things on here. So it just gives you a little bit more information if you do have the hit and you need to kind of figure out whether or not that person is really on the list or not.
Marcy, this is Tom. I just
Sure.
wanted to add one to just a comment. Don't forget to screen forwarders as well. Because some of you may remember, I think it was about a year ago or maybe a year and a half ago, but there were 5 or 6 international freight forwarding companies who had some allegations against them from the U.S. government. It wasn't even around export compliance. I think it was around Foreign Corrupt Practices Act or federal contracting, but they got put on one of the lists because of that allegation. And then suddenly, many of the U.S. companies who were working with those forwarders were not allowed to use them for a period of time. Now, it was kind of a flash in the pan thing. I mean, I think it was resolved pretty quickly because obviously those forwarders don't want to be on that list, and they were able to get their names removed in a matter of like days or weeks, I think. But it was just another example where suddenly companies who had been using these forwarders weren't allowed to for a period of time, and they had to find other people to move their freight for them. So don't just focus on your customers and your employees, but remember to include everybody in the transaction.
Absolutely. And to kind of have a note on that, even some of your customers may end up on the list. I worked for a big aerospace company where one of their divisions was debarred for a day, and that kind of turned into a fiasco, so that all of those other divisions of that company were not allowed to receive anything. Their suppliers wouldn't work with them. The freight forwarders wouldn't work with them. So the government, when they try to make a point to add people to the list, they will do that. But your responsibility is that if you are shipping to somebody while they're on that list, it's a violation to you if you use, that's the example that Tom gave with the freight forwarder, if you use them during the time they're on the list and you didn't do the screening, it's actually a violation. even though they came back off. So would the government come after you? Probably not give you fines and penalties, but maybe a slap on the wrist and kind of do some inquiries into what is your practice with restricted party screening, but it is something that you have to be aware of. Some of the other ways that you can do that, what I showed you was the manual input that you can put in, type in the name and do the screening. That works again if you're doing a lower amount of transactions, but once again, if you have hundreds of transactions, you want to automate that type of screening. So visual compliance as well as MK Data and some of these other vendors that are out there will provide the service where you can send them a file on a regular basis, whether it's once a day, 3 times a day, once an hour, that sends to their system to do the screening, and then the results would come back. Generally what happened is that you should include a hold in your own system for all the transactions. So all of your, whether you create a new customer, a new supplier, or you add a new employee to the system, there would be an automatic hold until it's been sent over to the screening mechanism, whether it's a third-party tool or whether it's your internal system, but that there would be a hold, and once it's been screened, it would come back and release the hold. If there's a possible hit, then it would stay on hold until the hit is resolved. One of the things here is that you can do a batch process, and so we'll show you visual compliances where it's an Excel spreadsheet, and there's different formats, and you just have to work with your IT and work with the third-party vendor as to how that format would be that you would send and come back. So it's kind of almost like the old FTP type of things where they come and get the data or you send the data. There's other ways that you can do it as well. Like I said, you can, if you have an SAP system or a JD Edwards ERP system, Oracle systems, they have modules internally into the systems. They are databases themselves. Technically, that's what the ERP system is, but the database within it can also do the screening. So we know that they have modules or mechanisms that you can turn on that can do that screening. Of course, you'll have to have those modules configured, and you'll probably have to have either your IT person or hire an outside person to come in and modify and configure those tools, but then you'll also have to figure out where the data is going to come from. So if you have an SAP tool, SAP doesn't supply the denied parties list, the entities list, the debarred list. You actually either have to type in the data or you'll have to have it provided from a third party like Visual Compliance or MK Data, and they can send you those lists on a regular basis as well that can be downloaded into your ERP system. So how often should you screen? This question I get a lot. How often should I be doing this? Well, it really depends on your business and how you're set up. If you're in Amazon or Dell where you're getting an order and you're shipping it out within 24 hours, I would say the only time you need to screen is at the time that you take the order, because you don't want to go fulfill the order if you can't do business with that entity. So before you would process the order and send it off to the warehouse or the manufacturing site to make the goods, you'll want to screen it there. If your manufacturing process and turnaround process is longer than a week, or even I would say 2 to 3 days, you want to screen on the back end well. So that would be 2 times the screening. Once in the beginning when the order is created or the purchase order is created to your supplier, and then on the back end when you're talking about customers before you ship it out, before shipping documents are created. That's generally how a lot of people will set that up. Especially if you have a 6-month lead time, you'll want to screen periodically throughout your manufacturing process, because as you can see with Pratt & Whitney, they were added on, and you may be in this long contract with them. You want to make sure that you can actually complete the project. So if you're dealing with different suppliers, subcontractors, you want to make sure that you're periodically screening. And we usually say once a quarter may be good, but it just depends on how many entities you have. If you're dealing with the big guys like the Pratt & Whitneys and other big contractors, subcontractors, generally you're going to know if they get in trouble because they're published and they're out there on the Federal Register. And if you're signing up for some of these things that come from BIS or DDTC, those newsletters, it's out there, and you'll see it. But if you're dealing with a lot of small mom and pop type shops, or you're dealing with individuals, you're going to want to screen more than once every quarter. because like we said, these lists can be updated every day. It's not every day that they are updated, but I have seen it where certain lists are updated 2 or 3 times in one day. And if you're selling to that entity and it's exported out, once that Federal Register is published, you violated the regulations. So you want to make sure that you are doing a timely screening against these lists. And you really have to kind of check out what's your customer base. Is it the same customer? Do you have one customer where you do thousands of orders against? Do you really need to do it and they're a big time manufacturer? You probably don't need to screen that often. But if you're dealing with individuals that are purchasing things off a website like the Amazons and the Dells, then you're going to want to screen quite a bit. The other box that we have right here is that you want to make sure that you're periodically rechecking all of the lists. When you look at your employees, generally we say at least minimum once a year, but you should always screen your employees at new hire, and then you'll want to periodically screen them. And believe it or not, when I worked for a big telecommunications company, they actually had someone that was added to the debarred list. He was moonlighting doing arms dealing. So you never know what's going to happen with, especially if you have one of these big companies and thousands of employees. You can't always keep track of what's going on. Smaller employer, you pretty much know when someone's going to get in trouble. So once again, how often should you screen? Just again, it just really depends on your business and your manufacturing process and your supply chain. But like Tom said, you should be screening every entity that's involved in your business. And so that would include employees, customers, suppliers, visitors. It would also be your freight forwarders, distributors. It would even be your service providers you should be screening. So the people that would come in and clean the floors, janitorial services. You really should be looking at all of those people because you don't want to be doing business with people that are on those lists, especially if you're involved in exporting, and also if you're involved in defense contracts. You really don't want people in there that are on one of these lists because they're known to do some illegal activity already. So what should you do and how can you test on how often you should screen? One of the things that we take a look at is start with a frequency that you're doing a lot, at least once a week. If you're not seeing a lot of hits, there's not a lot of things that are updated, then you can kind of go a little bit longer and just keep making adjustments as to see which works for your company. And if you go with one of these third-party service providers that you're implementing it in with your ERP system, this is a big key of how do you get this right. And there's no right or wrong answer for that. There's nothing I could say that this is what's right for your company. It is kind of a test and see what works. I've implemented a lot of these types of programs with different companies, and the first time at one company we had 1 million orders that were put on hold, and that's not something that you want to see. So you have to kind of adjust the sensitivity of the screening, especially if you're automating, to make sure that you're not making it too sensitive where it's picking up everything, like company or limited and things like that nature that it shouldn't be picking up on. So there's different things that you can do to tweak the system to make sure that you're not doing all these different hits that are needless. So if you're dealing with something like an Amazon.com and you get a lot of Smiths out there, you want to make sure that you're not hitting on a Tom Smith or a John Smith. You want to make sure you're only hitting on Wayne Smith, and then the Wayne Smiths, you may want to make sure that people put in their middle initials. So there may be some different things down the road or earlier in the process that you will have to change to make your life easier with restricted party screening. And I think that's where a lot of people get lost, is that it's really the data that's fed into it is also something that you need to take a look at. So the Wayne P. Smith example is that you may need to start asking for middle initials if you're dealing with individuals all the time, because otherwise you're going to get a lot of hits on a Wayne Smith. So what do you do when you have a match? So we've kind of walked through a few of the things where you take a look and really look at all of the information that you have. So make sure you're looking at the address, look at the name, gave the Wayne P. Smith example, make sure you're looking at the middle initial. Look at the country. So there are a lot of Latin American names that are on the list where someone may be, for example, I think Martinez is on the list, but you've got Martinez in Mexico and you've got one in Chile. If the person that's on the list is in Chile and the person you're dealing with is in Mexico, the probability of that is very low that you're dealing with a restricted party. It's most likely you're not, because you've got to look at the names, and that's what you've got to become familiar with too, that who's ever doing the screening understands these different cultures in names and acronyms that go on out there. And you'll become familiar with it as you do more and more. It really just takes practice that you look at the screening methodology to understand that Martinez is like Smith in Latin America. So those are the types of things. The other example is Mohammed. There's lots of names with Mohammed that are on the list, but Mohammed's in lots of Middle Eastern names. So it's one of those things that you have to take a look with and then kind of tweak your system so that you're not ending up with all of these hits against the list. The next thing is that you always want to take a look at the Federal Register. The Federal Register can give you lots of details as to what are the restrictions. They give you more names. They may give you birth dates. And so those are other things that you can use to help resolve the issue. If you still can't figure it out as to whether or not your entity is really on the list, you can contact the government. And I will tell you, the State Department is not very helpful in this area, but the Commerce Department is. So it just depends on which list you're on. And OFAC's pretty helpful as well. But you can always help and try to see if they can help you out to resolve the issue. But quite frankly, if you're not sure, you can also do your own research. Go back to the party, ask them more questions, search the internet, look at their website, see if there's any more information on that person that can be helpful. If you still can't figure it out, my suggestion is to deny the transaction and just make sure that you're not dealing with that entity and just say, look, we don't have enough information. If the customer really wants the product and they're not a restricted party, they will give you as much information as you need to make that decision. If they're a restricted party, they're probably the person that's going to be violent on the phone with you and do everything they can to get you to sell the product to them. So that's why you got to take a look and do your due diligence when you're screening in the back. So Tony, I'm going to stop there and see if there's any additional questions.
Yeah, we do have a few. Thanks. More of just a comment. Can you talk a little bit, Marcy, we have a few questions around dynamic screening. Can you just kind of explain what that is and how it works and is a little bit different from the batch process that we outlined?
So on the dynamic screening, so there's a few different things that you can do. The individuals, you can type in the names like I showed you, where there's the one piece where you can type in the name and get the results back, or you can do like the batch process where you can create a list and then that's sent in, and then it can be all of the entities can be screened at one time and you get a result back as to what is a hit and what is not. And if there is a hit, then you would take it upon yourself to go in and resolve that hit. So there's different services that these providers can offer, and I don't know if I answered that or not. Tom, you may be able to answer it better than I can on the dynamic screening.
Yeah, no, I think it is. I think the point with dynamic screening is that the service providers who offer that, they will take the data when you enter it and they will store it in their database and continually monitor it so that if there is any change in the list down the road, you'll get notified of it. So in other words, Klaus Buhler, for example, we showed you the example of him before. If you did a screen for him and he wasn't on the list and then at some point later he was, well, it's up to you to continually go back and put his name in, whereas with dynamic screening, you would enter his name in once, and then any time down the road, if he was added to the list or if there was a change, you would be notified about that. So it's another add-on service that some of the providers do, but it's nice because it's being monitored even though you don't have to do anything about it. It's being dynamically monitored.
Thank you. Yep, I misunderstood.
Yeah. Okay, so one of the questions is, do you know approximately how much an automated screening system costs? And Marcy, before you say that, I just want to add that We've shown visual compliance here, and it's the one that we recommend, but Export Solutions does not have any relationship with visual compliance or with e-customs. We don't get any royalties or fees from recommending them. It's simply the one that we think is the best and the one that we use. So just take that for what it's worth. There are others out there, but so I don't know, Marcy, do you have any thoughts on
yeah, this screening, it can range all over the place. So a lot of these third-party providers will charge you based on the number of transactions that you do. So it can be anywhere from $1,500 per year to $1 million per year. And I know it takes your breath away, but once again, it depends on how you set it up. If you're doing something like an SAP system where you've got to get an outside consultant to come in and help you configure your system, and then you've got to pay another party to send the list to you on a periodic basis, that can get up into the hundreds of thousands of dollars. So just be honest with you. When you're doing something like the visual compliance piece here, they will generally charge you by the number of transactions you have. So the less transactions that you have, the lower the cost is going to be. So if you have 100 to 200 or 1,000 a year, it's going to be a lot less than if you're doing 1,000 a day. Because when you're looking at a visual compliance or an MK data type system, it's a hosted solution, so that's why they charge you, because it's on their servers, it's their IT folks. You're just sending the data to them. So while you have some commitment on your own side from IT to send them the data and have this interchange in between, it really looks at what is going to be put on the bandwidth of their server. So they charge you based on the number of transactions, and then they also charge you on the number of lists that you're going to screen against. So the more lists you screen against, the more expensive it's going to get.
Good. Yeah, the best thing I would say there is just to contact multiple vendors and get quotes, from them, and then compare apples to apples and make sure that that you're getting the same amount of screening, the same number of lists. Is it manual versus dynamic? All those different options. Just like with anything, you just need to get different pricing.
And we have a list. I don't know, Tom, if you want to send it out of all the different vendors that are out there or not.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, we can provide you a list of different numbers. And I've only talked really about MK and visual compliance and SAP, but there's lots of other companies out there too. There's OCREs, which is, they also have other modules, and even with visual compliance, they have other modules that'll help with screening and classification databases. So it depends on what it is that you need and what your needs are. The solutions are out there. You can piecemeal it and just get the restricted party screening, or you can get their other services and tools that they have. So it can get very expensive, or you can keep it at a cost prohibited lower cost for you, just depending on what it is that you need.
Mm-hmm. Okay, here's a question. If we deal with a customer and the customer is a restricted party, but they lie to us and provide us false information, name, address, etc., we screen that false information and ship to them. Are we still in violation?
No. If you've done your due diligence, and I've seen this happen quite a bit, where the person's lied to you, they give you the wrong address, they tell you it's going to the wrong place, they fill out an end-use certificate, and you've done your due diligence, and it still gets out, and the government comes back, generally what they will come back and do is ask you for the history. So the key here, too, is when you are screening is that you have a record of what you screened. And when you're dealing with visual compliance, you have to ask them and some of these other vendors as to whether or not they keep the logs and the records of the screens. If they don't, you'll have to do a screen print and put that in your record. But what you would have to go back to the government is to prove that you've done that due diligence, that they did lie to you, and that all the information that was provided to you, you had no way of knowing that they were in violation. And generally that's what happens there, is that the government would then come back and ask you to help do a sting operation, and I've seen that lots of times. So it doesn't mean that you're going to be in trouble. You just need to make sure that you have your records kept so that you can prove that you did do the due diligence and the screening, and that there was no intent to violate the regulations.
Then you get to play international superstar spy and become so it's a lot of fun then.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, this is a question. This sounds like a company kind of like an Amazon or one of the large companies that you talked about, Marcy. we sell online thousands of items per day. How do you manage screenings for that when you have a customer buying online? This is kind of a multi-part question. So can you do instantaneous screening of that customer and then release the order as the sale occurs, or do they have to wait until the screening occurs for the sale to be processed?
So in that case, and I'll tell you, I used to work in Dell, so that's why I bring that up a lot, which had lots of online orders. And so what happened is that it was part of their ERP system. So if you have SAP or Oracle or even a homegrown system, that it was part of it. And it is instantaneous screening. So as the customer's entering their order, it goes through a series of screening steps. And if there's no hit, the order would automatically be released. And of course you're going to have those that are hits, but then you're going to have someone that goes in and monitors basically the workspace or the workflow and queue to screen those. And I will tell you, Dell had 6 people. That's all they did all day was do restricted party screening. So it is a burden, but you certainly don't want to have the fines or your business shut down because you're not doing the screening. So it is a burden, it is a cost, but you do have to take that into account. It just depends on the number of screens that are happening, and you may have to hire someone to actually do the screening. But that's where you also have to play with the sensitivity as to what the screening is and what does it make sense. You know, Dell was selling computers with encryption, and at the time I was there, encryption was a big thing. Needed licenses to a lot of places. Now that's not so much, but if you're selling things that are EAR 99 items, you still need to do the screening, but you're probably not going to have as many holds and checks. It depends on who's ordering your stuff and who wants your stuff. So you just got to kind of take a look at your customer base and how it's set up and kind of tweak your system so that it doesn't put the holds on. So things like you get rid of the companies so that there's lots of things on here that have limited, incorporated. Get rid of those types of words and take them out. The misses and the misters. And a lot of these screening mechanisms already have that embedded in, but there may be some other things in there that you can take out. It's like, for example, if you're a gun manufacturer and you everybody's got gun in their title, then you may want to take out gun as a hit word. So there's different things that you can do to kind of tweak the screening, but you're definitely going to have to automate it if you have that number of transactions. There's no way you're manually going to be able to survive unless you hire like 30 people.
Good point. Great. Well, that's all the questions we have. If anybody else has any questions, we have a few minutes left. Go ahead and type those in. And I don't know, this is the end of the slides, right, Marcy?
It is.
Great. Well, I want to thank everybody for joining. Hopefully this was helpful for you. Again, just a reminder that it will be recorded and offered on our website. If you missed any part of this, you can go back there typically within a week, access that recording, as well as get a copy of the slides. You can download a PDF copy of the slides for your use. So I'd like to thank everybody for joining today. I hope you have a great rest of your afternoon and a great week. And our contact info is here. Feel free to contact Marcy or myself if we weren't able to answer any questions for you. Or if you have follow-up, we'll be happy to discuss those with you. Thanks, everyone.